Welcome to the second module on volcano deformation. One of the aims of volcano geodesy is to find the geometrical form of magma bodies responsible for producing surface deformation during an eruption, like in this case. This is done by considering what kind of surface deformation fields are produced by different source types and comparing predictions of a series of models to observations. In this module, we also study the inversion of geodetic data and also consider models that go beyond the elastic half space assumption. The geometry of a magma body can have a large influence on the resulting surface deformation field, so the search for the best fitting geometry of a magma body is in essence about pattern recognition. What kind of predicted model deformation pattern best fits an observed surface deformation field? This figure here, prepared by Ronnie Grabentine at University of Alaska, provides an overview. It is from a book chapter summarizing some of the lessons learned regarding volcano deformation sources in Iceland. The figure has illustrations of 4 magmatic source geometry approximations for commonly used models and their predicted surface ground deformation patterns shown with colors. Each of the 4 columns in this figure provides an overview of the ground surface deformation field produced by a particular source. The 4 types of sources considered are the Mogi source, number 2, a more general spheroid source, and then dikes and sills. In all cases, these are so-called analytical models, meaning that the surface deformation field can be written explicitly using mathematical formulas. These formulas are, however, very complicated except for the Mogi source. The model assumptions are the same as for the Mogi model, that the magma source resides within a uniform elastic half space. This means it has no surface topography, the surface of the Earth is flat, and there is no change in material properties. All the material is of equal strength and deforms instantaneously like a spring in response to applied forces. Let's look at each source separately. We begin with the overview of the Mogi source, or the point source of pressure, where the radius of the spherical source is small compared to the depth. This figure provides a summary from the previous module. You have seen before the geometrical sketch of the source in the upper panel and a cross-section of deformation along a profile across the source center projected to the surface in the lower panel. The horizontal and vertical displacement fields are given in map view in the right panels. The upper one has the vertical displacement and the lower one the horizontal. The displacement fields, as shown here, are in all cases normalized to the maximum displacement. So on the cross-section, the highest value is 1, showing where the largest deformation occurs. Horizontal distances are here normalized to the respective source centroid depth. This is convenient when we want to compare the surface deformation pattern between different source geometries, and because the width of the deformation fields scales with the depth. The deeper the source, the wider the surface deformation field. The characteristics of the surface deformation field include axis symmetric pattern, where vertical displacement larger than horizontal displacement occur nearest to the source, and most of the vertical signal is within a horizontal distance equal to 1 source depth. That is a distance on the surface equal to the depth to the center of the source. The model for a spherical source can be extended to consider largest source radius, so a finite source volume is better considered. The predicted surface deformation field for such a source is comparable to that predicted by the Mogi model, but has also some deviation from it that can be used to attempt to invert separately for the radius of the magma source and its pressure change. In most cases, this is quite difficult. Equations exist also to describe deformation due to a magma body of a more general spheroid shape. That is, an ellipsoid that can be described with one semi-major axis and one semi-minor axis, and parameters describing the orientation of the spheroid. Such equations are, for example, described in a paper published by Young in 1988. The spheroid can be tilted, then the deformation field is not symmetric around its central point. More uplift occurs in the region where the spheroid is closest to the surface, and the horizontal displacement pattern can be very asymmetric. Here is an overview of the deformation field produced by a dike, modeled as a so-called dislocation in an elastic half-space. The dike area is modeled as a rectangle of some length and width, and here there is uniform opening on the dike plane. Since the dimensions of the dikes are such, it can be some kilometers in length, cutting through few kilometers of crust, with opening on the scale of meters. Then dikes and sills can also be referred to as magmatic sheets, emphasizing they are typically very thin compared to the area. In the example shown, the surface deformation pattern is due to a dike that is vertical, but it can, however, be of any orientation, that is, any strike and depth. The equations describing the surface deformation for this type of source were published by Okada in 1985, and this kind of source model is sometimes referred to as Okada dislocation. The word dislocation in this context refers to crystallography, where dislocation refers to a displacement of a part of a crystal lattice structure. In the geoscience context, it is similar, but on a macro scale. In order to fully describe the source geometry and opening of an Okada dislocation with constant opening, we need 8 parameters in total. For the Mogi source, we needed 4 parameters. The model is therefore much more complicated to calculate, and it has more free parameters. A model for a vertical dike is, for example, often appropriate when modeling regional dikes in rift zones formed in response to rift extension. The horizontal deformation field shows the opening of the dike well, as it has lobes of displacements away from the dike on both sides of it. There are, however, some peculiar effects related to the ends of the dike. Some minor contraction occurs towards the ends of the dike. The vertical pattern has lobes of uplift on each side of the dike, with relative subsidence in the middle. For this source, the horizontal displacements are larger than the vertical. The dike pushes the ground away from the dike plane. The final model is a sill, modeled also as an Okada dislocation. In this case, the dislocation is horizontal. Vertical displacements are much larger than the horizontal, since the sill pushes the ground mostly up and down, but the ratio will depend on the depth. The source shape is here modeled as a square, therefore the square pattern of surface deformation in the map view. Horizontal displacements are largest close to the sill edge, and there are also other models available to represent sills. One is so-called penny-shaped crack model, representing a circular shaped sill. The parameters in that model are the radius of the sill and imposed pressure change within the sill, rather than the specific opening in the Okada sill model. Here we have again the 4 models side by side. The differences between these models are quite clear. Key parameters to look for when interpreting surface deformation fields are thus the ratio of horizontal versus vertical displacement, the spatial variations of these, and the amount of symmetry. In practice on volcanoes, we typically only have observations of parts of the deformation fields. for example at few GNSS sites or for INSAR only in areas that are coherent in interferograms. As we often have limited observations or even just a glimpse of what the deformation field looks, our possibilities to constrain the geometry of magma sources may be limited. Let's look again at data from the Eyjafjallajökull volcano. The results we see here display deformation due to intrusive events, one in 1994 and the other in 1999 and 2000. These events were part of 18-year-long period of intermittent unrest preceding the 2010 eruptions at Eyjafjallajökull that closed Europe's airspace. The map shows the outline of the calderas of Eyjafjallajökull volcano marked as E and the Katla volcano as K. White shows glaciers, so the calderas are subglacial. Observed horizontal displacements inferred from GNSS in relation to the intrusions are here shown as red arrows, and vertical change is shown in blue. Notice the scale in the lower left corners. The horizontal arrows point away from a common center under the southeastern slopes of Eyjafjallajökull for both the intrusions. Blue arrows show there is uplift as well. In this study by Sigurlaug Hjaltadóttir and colleagues, the GNSS data were fit to the so-called penny-shaped crack model. Red stars show the location of the central point of the best-fitting sills, and yellow circles the lateral extent. The best-fitting volume for the sills according to these models were 11 and 30 million cubic meters, respectively, for the 94 and 1999 to 2000. In this figure, we have results from INSAR modeling by Rikke Pedersen of the same 1994 intrusions. Panels on the left show observations, that is, examples of interferograms formed using data acquired by the ERS satellite, with images taken before and after the intrusions. Each fringe corresponds to 28 millimeters of line-of-sight change from ground to satellite. The outline of the Eyjafjallajökull glacier is shown with the black line. The interferograms are overlaid on shaded topography map. Where there is only grayish color, there is no useful INSAR observation. The ground surface remained incoherent. We can see 3 fringes or more related to deformation on the southeast side of the volcano, and also a fringe north of the volcano in panels A and C. Fringes can also be due to atmospheric disturbances. Some of the irregular structures in the interferograms further away from the volcano are due to such perturbations. The larger panels in the center show predicted displacements of a model using Okata Sildos location, and the panel on the right shows the residual interferograms. The residuals are small, so the model can well fit the observations. The fringe pattern has disappeared in the residual interferograms when compared to the observations. Rather than just using one constant opening along the sill plane, the area of the sill is here divided up into patches. This is a common approach when interpreting deformation due to magma sheets. One begins with a simple model of uniform opening, but can then proceed to try to estimate the opening distribution. The lower panel in the middle shows a grid of the sill plane and the inferred sill opening distribution. This distributed opening sill model leads to the predicted model fringe pattern shown in the upper middle panel. The sill is horizontal at 4.5 km depth, and the volume of the distributed sill model is found by summing up the contributions from each patch. It is found to be 17 million cubic meters. The figure with the model fringes has also 2 rectangles, one outlined with solid black line showing the outline of the plane used to estimate the distributed slip. It has an inner rectangle drawn with the hatched black line. This is the outline of a best-fitting sill model if uniform opening is assumed. And the green is the location of a Mogi source model assumed. All the models agree fairly well on the center of the intrusion, but the lateral extent of the sources varies. The largest lateral extent is for the distributed slip model. In that model, the northern periphery of the modeled intrusion reaches to an area of recorded seismicity, indicating a close connection. The suggested explanation is that the earthquakes are caused by opening of a narrow channel from depth, feeding the sill. Let's look at another example. In the last 3 months, prior to the 2010 eruptions of Eyjafjallajökull, a complex intrusion evolved in the roots of the volcano. This figure shows part of the dataset used to model that intrusive period. The 3 panels show, respectively, observations, predicted deformation from a best fit model using a so-called boundary element method to estimate deformation due to variable opening of magmatic sheets, and residuals between the observations and the model predictions. Interferograms have been unwrapped and then partitioned into so-called quad-3 areas for modeling purpose. Arrows indicate horizontal GPS displacement. The location of the Eyjafjallajökull glacier is shown with the E. The study covers the pre-eruptive inflation period up to the 20th of March 2010. Based on the GNSS, the pre-eruptive time span is split into 2 time periods, before and after 1st of March. Observed GNSS displacements for the first period are shown as black arrows and modeled as yellow. For the second period, observations of horizontal displacements are red and model arrows are in orange. The model has sill opening up in the first period and a sill and a dike in the second period. The gridded areas show the surface projections of the source patches where mean opening is greater than inferred standard deviation estimate for opening. And in this next figure, we see magma sheets models for the pre-eruptive 2010 intrusion. The modeling suggests evolution of a complex intrusion in the months prior to the eruption. Opening values represent the inferred mean opening of each patch, only plotted when this value is larger than the estimated standard deviation. Background map shows shaded topography with ice caps in white. Black dots are earthquake epicenter in respective time periods. Panel A shows the initial sill opening until 28 February 2010. Panel B shows continued sill opening 1st to 20th of March. And panel C shows inferred tilted dike opening also in the 1st to 20th of March period. The modeling indicates that a magmatic intrusion of a complex geometry modeled as 2 sills and 1 dike with a total volume of about 50 million cubic meters grew over a period of 3 months in the roots of the volcano. On 20th of March, an eruption finally broke out. This pre-eruptive intrusion was certainly much more complicated than many of us expected. We have seen earlier that many volcano deformation models are possible when we are interpreting observed ground deformation. But what is the actual approach to find the most appropriate model and the best fitting model parameters? The actual process of finding a model that best fits geodetic data requires a mathematical approach. Some may find it difficult to understand, but it is instructive to try to understand the process involved. These equations, they summarize the process and are the key to understand what is done in volcano geodesy in the process of finding the best fit model. It's actually a very general approach. If you need to fit a model to observations, this is generally what is needed. After going through these equations, we look at examples of the fitting process. We need a mathematical estimate of what is the best fitting model because we need to search for such a model in a systematic manner. We need a statistical parameter that can help us to compare how well model fit observation. For example, in the case of Eyjafjallajökull, 1999 to 2000 intrusive episode, shown here again in the small map view. A parameter commonly used is a so-called reduced chi-squared. We need to go through the symbols and the equations shown here to understand it. First, we need to organize our observations. They can, for example, be GNSS displacements, line of sight change in pixel of an interferogram, or ground tilt measurements. We do this by organizing them into one vector of observations, denoted here as V superscript obs, standing for observations. It's a string of numbers that contains all the observations. We use a model to predict what the deformation should be at all the locations where we have observations according to the model. This is our model prediction vector. We subtract these two vectors to derive a third vector that contains all the residuals, the difference between observations and model, at all our locations. This vector holds information on how well the observations fit the model predictions. But the observations may be of different quality, so we need a scale that is to divide each of the residuals with the estimated uncertainty of the observations. That is the vector R as shown in the figure, which is basically a string of numbers showing the difference between model and observations at each observational point, scaled by the uncertainty. The next step is to multiply each number in the string by itself. Mathematically, that is the same as saying we multiply the R vector by the so-called transpose of this vector, denoted R, superscript T. And we add all the numbers together. We then have the so-called weighted residual sum of squares, WRSS. It is one number, and the larger it is, the larger the deviations of model predictions from observations. However, WRSS will also get larger the greater the number of observations, denoted by N in the figure. We need somehow to take that into consideration. We can also expect the model to fit better the more free parameters a model has, denoted by M in the figure. This is taken into consideration by dividing the weighted residual sum of squares by N minus M. This forms the so-called reduced chi-squared variable. We can now try different model parameters and see how it influences the calculated reduced chi-squared. This is what inversion of geodetic data is about. Finding the model parameters that produces the lowest reduced chi-squared value. Let's look further at this process for the Eyjafjallajökull 99 to 2000 intrusion. The main panel in this figure is an XY graph. There is one model parameter on each axis, the depth of the intrusion on the x-axis and the volume of the intrusion on the y-axis. These results are from the study of Hjaltadóttir and colleagues, and the GNSS data is fit to a penny-shaped crack model for a sill. In this space, the star marks the values of the parameters for the best fitting model that produce the lowest value for the reduced chi-squared. The contours give an indication of how the quality of the fit varies if the model parameters change. We see that the contours are in the form of ellipsoids. This suggests that there is a so-called trade-off between parameters. The alignment of the ellipses indicate that the data can be fit equally well with somewhat shallower source of less volume and a deeper source of somewhat larger volume. This raises the question of what is the best way to find uncertainties on model parameters and how estimates of one model parameter depends on the value of another model parameter. There are actually a number of different ways to find the lowest value of chi-squared parameter, or a similar parameter that quantifies the best fit. One approach that also gives detailed information on certainties on the model parameters and their interdependence is something called a Bayesian approach. In this approach, one initially sets bounds on possible model parameters that are so-called prior beliefs. These bounds are then updated considering how well model predictions fit observations, considering uncertainties of the observations. At the end of this process, we have posterior estimate of the parameters, as well as a description of their full uncertainty and interdependence. This approach is, for example, described in an article by Marco Bagnardi and Andy Hooper entitled Inversion of Surface Deformation Data for Rapid Estimates of Source Parameters and Uncertainties, a Bayesian approach. Their approach is implemented in a software package that is freely available to the scientific community. The figure shown here is an inversion example similar as we have looked at before, with data, model predictions, and residuals. The data are interferograms formed from data from the Sentinel-1 satellites covering a magnitude 6.4 earthquake in China in 2015. The three panels on the right show three different interferograms with black arrows on data plots showing the flight direction of the satellite, the look direction with the incidence angle in degrees, and the track number for the satellite path. One fringe corresponds to a change of 2.8 centimeters as the scale shows. For an earthquake fault, there are 9 model parameters. If we want to understand volcano deformation, we need to understand deformation produced by earthquakes, because these two also occur on volcanoes. The most commonly used model for earthquake faulting is of the Okada dislocation type that we have mentioned in the context of magmatic sheaths. For earthquakes, the model has a fault plane and slip on the fault, but no opening. There are 9 free models parameters to fully describe it, 3 for the location of the central point of the fault plane, 4 for the direction and tilt of the plane and its dimension, and 2 for the slip. Model predictions are shown in the middle panels from the inferred best fit model, referred to as the maximum a posteriori probability solution. This is the solution that is considered most probable. There the black rectangle shows the outline of the optimal fault plane, with the thicker line outlining the up-dip edge of the fault plane and the arrow representing the direction of slip. This figure here then shows the so-called probability density functions for the model parameters. This is a full statistical description of what is known about the fault parameters based on the inversion process. The bottom row shows histogram of distributions for each parameter. The red line is the most likely value for each of the model parameters, and the width of the distributions give an indication about the uncertainty on each parameter. From these, one can, for example, find the interval corresponding to one standard deviation uncertainty for the model parameters. All the panels above the bottom line show scatter plots that indicate how a pair of parameters is related. Some of these are in the form of ellipses, then indicating correlation or trade-off between model parameters. The Bayesian approach to inferred geodetic models can, once fully understood and implemented, give a rapid estimate of model parameters and full descriptions of their uncertainty in the forms of posterior probability density functions, sometimes referred to as PDFs. In general, it is very important to understand the uncertainties on derived source model parameters. And with this approach, we have a complete description about confidence intervals in the model parameters. We need to consider deviations from our assumptions of a uniform elastic half space. First of all, we need to consider if the magma that is moving in the subsurface is being emplaced in magmatic sheaths, sills or dikes, or moving in or out of a larger magma body, such as a finite-sized spheroid, or in or out of a spherical volume that is of small radius compared to depth as assumed in the MOGI model. When magma is flowing in or out of a larger magma body, it turns out that the inferred volume change of the source is not the same as the volume of the magma moving. The reason is that the magma residing in the magma body prior to the flow is compressible. If new magma flows into it, space can be created for it by two processes. First, the elastic deformation of the host rock outside the magma body, as we have evaluated with our elastic deformation model, but also by a second process, namely compression of the magma that resided in the magma body prior to flow. If there is a pressure change in a magma body, then the overall magma volume will change. The importance of this effect depends on the magma compressibility, as well as the elastic parameters of the surrounding elastic half space. For a spherical body, an equation can be derived relating the volume of magma flow into or out of the magma body to the volume change of the magma body itself, as shown in this figure. The ratio will depend on the ratio of compressibility and the host rock rigidity. The easier it is to compress the magma, the higher this ratio. In Iceland, we have found values as high as between 5 and 10. The volume ratio and the effect of magma compressibility has been studied in a paper by Eleonora Rivalta and Paul Siegel, where they evaluate the cases of magma extracted from a magma chamber and then placed in a magmatic sheet, silver dike, as shown in this figure. Based on observations and consideration of magma properties, they find a volume ratio in the range of 1.2 to 7.7 for gas-poor magma. Furthermore, the larger changes in magma compressibility can occur due to gas exsolution increase. So clearly this effect can be very significant. So far, we have only mentioned this one effect of magma bodies residing inside the Earth prior to magma flow. But let's look at another deviation from uniform elastic half space. There may be large effects due to variations in rheological properties, in particular due to so-called viscoelastic effects. We know that on a long time scale, the solid Earth can behave in a ductile manner, like a fluid of high viscosity. For example, this is witnessed by glacial isostatic adjustment due to ice load changes on the surface of the Earth. In this context, the important question becomes, what is the crustal relaxation time? In simple terms, it relates to the ratio of crustal viscosity and the elastic crustal strength. This figure has 4 quadrants. A situation in quadrant A on the upper left is considered in most deformation models. Elastic behavior and density difference between magma and host rock is not considered. The Earth behaves as a spring. If the time scale of the process considered is long, for example, magma recharging over decades, the Earth may behave more like a spring and a dust spot connected in a series, as shown schematically in panel B. Following an initial response, there is a delayed later response that can continue to drive deformation for a long time. One issue here is that we do not know well the relaxation time, but it may be as short as years or decades. Here are some model results from Tadashi Yamazaki and colleagues for a sill intruded in a viscoelastic material overlaid by an elastic layer, as shown in the schematic model at the bottom of this figure. There are 4 panels showing deformation at different times. The panel furthest to the left shows the displacement at time 0 after the sill is instantaneously injected. The other figures show deformation at times corresponding to 5, 10, and 100 relaxation times. Contours and profiles of the surface displacement is shown in the vertical direction. The red curve on the profile plots shows the vertical location at any given time. The blue changes in vertical since after the intrusion took place. Arrows in panel A at time 0 show horizontal surface displacements associated with the sill injection. The other panels show the change in horizontal surface displacement that accumulates after the magma injection stops. We see that in the long term, the initial pattern of deformation associated with sill inflation completely reverses just because of viscoelastic relaxation. This kind of behavior may therefore be relevant if viscosity of the earth is low, the timescale of the process is long, or we have a long period of observations. Of course, there can be a viscoelastic response following magma moving out of volcano subsurface during an eruption. Models have been derived where there is a spherical shell around a magma body, a viscoelastic aureole, as shown in this model by Paul Siegel, developed to address repressurization in a magma body following an eruption. This model would, for example, be appropriate for a long-lasting spherical magma body that has a zone of hot material next to more fluid magma. The figure shows a schematic of the magma system. Panel A shows the pre-eruptive state with pressurized magma chamber, as well as a link to a deeper pressure source. The pressure of the deeper source remains the same throughout the course of events. Panel B shows the co-eruptive state, masses erupted, causing the chamber pressure to drop, and the viscoelastic shell surrounding the magma chamber responds initially elastically. In the post-eruptive state, magma flows into the chamber from deep reservoir and the viscoelastic shell deforms. Both of these processes contribute to a time-dependent pressure in the magma chamber. Modeling of this process indicates the resulting surface deformation can be highly variable depending on the exact values of the model parameters, and it can be difficult to constrain the separate roles of viscoelastic relaxation of the shell and the role of magma inflow from the deep source. The final example of approaches that go beyond the uniform elastic half-space approach is a detailed numerical model that can incorporate known results from structural studies based on seismic tomography, for example. This figure shows an example of such a study by Tim Masterlark and colleagues at Ogmok volcano on one of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. The panel on the left shows a domain of the numerical model using the so-called finite element method. Exploded views on the left reveal the subcaldera core, pressured magma chamber, and the mesh. In this model, the values of elastic strength parameters in each location, including the so-called Young's modulus, denoted E, was applied in the model based on results from seismic tomography. The panel on the right shows the model domain in exploded view to reveal the internal structure, showing the values of the Young's modulus used in the model according to the color scheme. The two XY graphs show parameter values. The two XY graphs show parameter values in the two specific locations as introduced into the modeling as probability density functions for the S-wave velocity in black and the Young's modulus E in red. This model found a depth to the magma source of 3.6 kilometers compared to 2.5 kilometers depth when a uniform elastic half-space model was used. So there's actually a very significant difference. The heterogeneous model suggests a deeper source. There are still more complications that can be addressed in models. For example, the consideration of temperature-dependent crustal viscosity, as it is known that temperature will have a large effect on crustal viscosity. A viscosity value specific for each location can be implemented in a numerical model in a similar pattern as elastic parameters can be inserted based on seismic tomography studies. The question, however, becomes, how well do we know the spatial variations of rheological parameters to include in a model? In most cases, there is a large uncertainty. For example, if we want to invoke a model of temperature-dependent viscosity, we need a temperature model for the volcano surface. So, Even if the elastic deformation models have been successful to describe deformation in many cases, there is the expectation that there will be large improvements in modeling approaches in the years to come, allowing us to learn a lot more on how exactly volcano interiors deform in response to magma flow. So, if you want to expand your knowledge, what I would do is consider carefully how we find uncertainties on these analytical volcano deformation models and go back to the paper by Marco Bagnardi and Andy Hooper, read that on how to get probability density functions for model parameters. And then I would go to some of the newer papers considering models considering magma mass and temperature structure, and compare it to what you have seen in this video. There is steady improvement. This module explains sort of what we can call traditional approach to modeling volcano geodesy and finding uncertainties. But the field is rapidly evolving and many new approaches are coming up, for example, to study the effects of transcrustal magmatic systems versus localized sources of deformation. Thank you.